targeting of areas where they believe that Muammar Gaddafi and his family are, or even less likely, boots on the ground, soldiers going in to try and depose the Libyan leader. Now, that has been opposed by the Libyan opposition, but certainly everything up to that point is under discussion at the moment here in London and in many other European capitals.
Many thanks, Alan. So plans are being drawn up and military hardware repositioned as the US, the EU and our allies weigh up options to solve the crisis in Libya. There appears to be two main options. Both would have to be blessed by the UN or NATO. A no-fly zone using fighter jets to patrol and shoot down Libyan aircraft ordered to attack protesters, and arming anti-government protesters. So whose assets are where? Well, the US has an aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, in the Red Sea. And near to Naples is the HQ of the US 6th Fleet. 8 vessels are there at the moment. There's also a US airbase in Aviano in Italy and a naval base in Rota in Spain. The British have an airbase in RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus and a naval base in Gibraltar. And the French have a vast airbase at Istres. Now I'm joined by Barak Sina, who's a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. You've just seen the list. Yes. What's most likely in your view?
What's most likely is that the United States will lead the efforts for no-fly zone. Currently, they are ambiguously positioning themselves to saying that they're simply there in order to place pressure on Gaddafi and to strip away his supporters, his inner crowd of supporters, as well as offer humanitarian and relief support. However, currently being discussed are the options for a no-fly zone.
What is a no-fly zone?
We saw for example, after the Gulf War, we saw a no-fly zone enforced in Iraq. A no-fly zone can gain its legitimacy by UN Articles 39 to 41 from the UN Charter that is simply criticising repression of a people. And
OK, so you go to the UN agree a no-fly zone. If the UN agrees in no-fly zone, what does that mean in the air? How far does it extend?
The UN doesn't have to explicitly agree to a UN fly zone, but legitimacy can be found, just like President Bush Sr. found legitimacy in Articles 39 to 41 of the UN Charter. However, if there was to be an explicit agreement by the UN, what you would have to do is you'd have to have 10 votes in the Security Council for a no-fly zone, and no one of the 5 permanent members would be casting an anti-vote. That would be sufficient.
And that's unlikely, in the view of China?
In the view of China, that would be unlikely, so therefore recourse would be made by mentioning how the UN Security Council has A, offered sanctions against Libya, and B, referring Libya to the EU International Criminal Court.
If the UN doesn't back a no-fly zone, doesn't vote for a no-fly zone, does that make a no-fly zone illegal?
Doesn't make it illegal, but it makes it still possible, but without explicit authorization. It still makes it possible.
And what is a no-fly zone?
A no-fly zone is just not allowing aircraft to come in that area of jurisdiction. So, for example, Gaddafi would not be able to have he would not be able to fly in his militias from African states. He wouldn't be able to be bombing his people. He wouldn't be able to be shelling the protesters. That would be a no-fly zone, not necessarily a UN no-fly zone, but a no-fly zone.
And what about protesters who might have access to Libyan jets in the east of the country?
That's a huge problem. For example, in Benghazi, where they've taken over an airfield, the problems with a no-fly zone is that it's very easy to down a rebel force. So there are many, many flaws in having a no-fly zone, and that's just one of a number of many. For example, it's possible for example, most of the atrocities that are being taken place on the ground, not by the air. Another problem is it can spiral into being a no-sail zone or a no-drive zone. It can suck international forces into Libya in an open-ended manner. So if there is a no-fly zone, what needs to happen is a UN resolution of some sort that demands that it is not open-ended and it's subject to review at certain intervals.
All right. Well, Barak, you've been very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll be back with more news from Europe later in this news hour, but for now it's back to Lauren and Doha.
Just one report you might find interesting from Reuters coming into us here, that the East Libyan unit of the state oil firm says production has fallen. It's now saying that production from its oil fields at 130,000 barrels per day, compared with the pre-protest levels of 400,000. So that's less than half the output than they had previously. Now let's take you back to Washington and listen to Hillary Clinton.
Into action and results. Marathon diplomacy at the United Nations and with our allies has yielded quick, aggressive steps to pressure and isolate Libya's leaders. USAID is focused on Libya's food and medical supplies and is dispatching 2 expert humanitarian teams to help those fleeing the violence and who are moving into Tunisia and Egypt, which is posing tremendous burdens on those 2 countries. Our combatant commands are positioning assets to prepare to support these critical civilian humanitarian missions. And we are taking no options off the table so long as the Libyan government continues to turn its guns on its own people. The entire region is changing, and a strong and strategic American response is essential. In the years ahead, Libya could become a peaceful democracy, or it could face protracted civil war, or it could descend into chaos. The stakes are high, and this is an unfolding example of using the combined assets of smart power, diplomacy, development, and defense to protect American security and interests and advance our values. This integrated approach is not just how we respond to the crisis of the moment. It is the most effective and most cost-effective way to sustain and advance our security across the world. And it is only possible with a budget that supports all the tools in our national security arsenal, which is what we are here to discuss. The American people are justifiably concerned about our national debt. I share that concern. But they also want responsible investments in our future that will make us stronger at home and continuing our leadership abroad. Just 2 years after President Obama and I first asked you to renew our investment in development and diplomacy, we are already seeing tangible returns for our national security. In Iraq, almost 100,000 troops have come home, and civilians are poised to keep the peace. In Afghanistan, integrated military and civilian surges have helped set the stage for our diplomatic surge to support Afghan-led reconciliation that can end the conflict and put al-Qaeda on the run. We have